You know what? I'm tired of JP Boost being the #1 best support skill to have equipped for 90% of Final Fantasy Tactics. Hello everyone, my name is Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman, and if you like theoretical discussions about how to fix jobs designed for multi-decade old games in a hypothetical future where maybe we see a re-release of that game, then a like on this video, a subscription to the channel, and consideration of checking out my Patreon and my YouTube members would be very much appreciated. Thank you so much. So today we are starting a discussion of every single job in Final Fantasy Tactics and what changes, if any, should be made to it for the eventual remaster or remake of Final Fantasy Tactics that we are all absolutely huffing the copium and believing is on the horizon. First off today, I want to talk about Squire, and yes, I know, I've not done proper in-depth discussion of any of these jobs or of FFT as a whole, as I've had that whole discussion on hold due to the fact that I do sincerely believe that we have a new version of the game on the horizon, but at the same time, I really like talking about FFT, and no matter how many haters I get in the comments that question why it is that I'm talking about a 30-year-old game and calling me a grifter as a result, because God forbid people like talking about things that they enjoy, I decided, you know what, now's the time. My interest is currently peaked. I want to talk about what we could see from these jobs in the future. So that's what we're going to do. So what is the idea here? The idea is that I want to sit down and break down every job in Final Fantasy Tactics, including the War of the Lions specific jobs, and discuss what makes them work, what maybe doesn't work, and how they can be modified or updated to work better with the overall job identity that they are built with in mind, and how we can work towards a better job identity based on what the job seems to be trying to do. With that in mind, we're going to be looking at equipment, primary abilities, secondary abilities, support, movement, all that type of fun stuff to try and craft a more comprehensive and cohesive job for Final Fantasy Tactics. Of course, we're going to be starting off with the Squire, seeing as how the Squire is the end-all, be-all of starter jobs in any Final Fantasy game, and I would argue any tactics game in general, and talk about some of the things that it does very well, and some of the things that are actually kind of broken and should probably be changed to accommodate the idea of a starter job. So, with that in mind, let's talk about gear. Squires are actually semi-versatile in terms of what gear they can equip, with things like swords, knives, axes, which is notable, and then clothes of all varieties and accessories of all varieties. They can't equip heavy armor or robes, and they do miss out on some opportunities as a result, but as a starter class where you really only want to be using it for your physical-based jobs anyway, it's kind of okay that they're limited in terms of what gear they can equip. Swords and knives are fairly universal in terms of what jobs can equip in Final Fantasy Tactics, as are clothes, but axes are a little bit more unique, and it's something that I want to focus on for this remade version of the job moving forward, seeing as how it's really only Squires and Geomancers that are using them with any sort of regularity, and even then you're probably not using them that much if you're trying to min-max. As far as abilities are concerned, you have the Fundaments job skill for Squire, which has a lot of very generalist and fairly weak abilities associated with it. You have Throw Stone to give you a very low damage ranged damage option, which is still useful in the early game, don't get me wrong. You have Focus that gives you an increase of 1 point to your physical attack, which you can actually stack up pretty dang well. Rush, which is a limited in terms of range and height melee attack that scales primarily off of your Brave, and if you have the martial arts skill equipped, and is most notable for its ability to circumnavigate any sort of counter skills, which in the early game when you're using Squires is going to be very nice against any sort of beasts that you don't want to take counter attacks from. And then finally the Salve skill that allows you to remove blind, silence, and poison, which admittedly is very useful in the early game, especially when you're first trying to get your chemists leveled and you maybe don't have the funds to just be dropping on item usage all the time. The idea here is that the Squire is going to give you an all-around useful set of abilities that you can utilize to clear the first few missions of the game, maybe deal with some random battles, until you get some better jobs online and no longer have to worry about having that versatility on hand. It's very much a jack of all stats and master of none type of scenario, which is fitting, I think. The Squire wants to be able to tech into a bunch of different types of jobs, a lot of different roles, and set up the characters who want to go into those roles for success down the line. Now, where things get interesting is when we start talking about the different support abilities and movement abilities that Squire has. You also get a reaction ability in counter tackle, which is completely fine for any character who doesn't have any other option. Just the ability to tackle something that hits you in melee. Cool. Great. Have some knockback, have some damage, fine. Pretty much any other reaction ability that's either more focused or stronger is going to be better, but it's a fine option. Where things get crazy is where we get into certain support abilities. The Squire has 4. Equip axes, which is not great, because axes are not great. We're going to talk about that. Beastmaster, which gives you the ability to give any monster adjacent to this character a new skill that sometimes can be very good. We're going to have a very interesting argument about that. We will come back to it. We have Defend, which basically just gives you an evasion boost in the direction that you're facing, which is largely not great. There's a couple of niche cases where it can be useful, but pretty much a weak option. There's a reason that it is the lowest JP required skill in the list. And then finally, JP Boost, or Gained JP Up, depending on which version of the game that you have, which is quite possibly the single most valuable and most used support ability in the game, and that's why we're going to be talking about it. Finally, as far as movement abilities are concerned, the Squire only has 1, which is Move +1, which again, one of the most used and most valuable movement abilities in the game. And again, I think that's fine, but we'll talk about it a little bit more in depth as we proceed here. So what is the idea of the Squire? The Squire is the job that you're going to be starting in for any character that you want to wind up teching into any sort of physical-based class. And while yes, the job-centric idea of FFT is that you jump between a bunch of different jobs, some of which are physical, some of which are magical, some of which are support-based, to get a particular build online for a character by the end game, the Squire is where you're going to be starting for, I would say, 90% of your characters. Bump that up to 100% if you care about having optimal strategizing thanks to things like JP Boost and Move +1. It's not a great class, it does not have good growths, its overall skill set is pretty lackluster once you leave the early game, but as far as starting points and foundations can go, not too shabby, not a bad start at all. Ideally, you want to do 2 things before you leave Squire behind forever. You want to pick up JP Boost and you want to pick up Move +1. The reason for this is twofold. First of all, JP Boost is just going to make your overall learning of new skills, and due to the way leveling works in FFT, new jobs way faster. And then also, movement in any sort of tactics game largely is king, so the ability to get extra move point for essentially free is really strong. This is combined with the fact that until much later in the game, you don't really have support or movement abilities that are worth taking compared to the power of JP Boost and Move +1, which gives them a massive amount of value. And that's where the crux of the problems with Squire comes in. It's fine that it has low stat growth. It's fine that it doesn't have a ton of skills that you really want to lean into, given the fact that it's a starter job. You want to get the idea of what a physical-based class can do, maybe pick up a couple of skills that are better for it, and then move into other jobs that are going to do that role better. And that's where the basis of our kind of rebuild is going to come from. So we now have an idea of what the best strengths and also problems with Squire are. It's a very dedicated, physical damage focused job that also has 2 of the best kind of support generalist abilities in the game, to the point that it overrides a lot of the abilities of future jobs, which should really not be the case. We also don't really have a specific focused role for the job, which I would argue is not great, seeing as how its equivalent job in the Chemist does. You see, the Chemist, as a quick side note, is your starting point for any sort of mage class. And of course that might seem weird, seeing as how the chemist is not actually casting any spells, but due to the way that jobs are structured in terms of how you learn new jobs in FFT, chemist is where you're going to be starting for any class that wants to become any sort of mage, whether it be black mage, white mage, time mage, oracle, etc., right? But despite that, the chemist has a great role as a ranged damage dealer and support unit that can last from the beginning to the end of the game. And I'd like to see Squire meet the similar sort of criteria. Kind of like how Warrior in Tactics Ogre Reborn is actually a class that you can use from the beginning to the end of the game due to its unique combination of activatable skills that gives it absolutely unmatched prowess in terms of damage dealing and melee combat. It is a niche, a very tight one, but it's still a niche that class can fulfill, and I'd like to see Squire be able to meet a similar sort of requirement. So here are the changes that I would propose. I would completely leave the active abilities of Squire alone. Give them focus, give them stone toss, rush, salve, that's fine. Fundaments is a decent activatable set of skills for any melee-focused class that you'd be happy to have until late in the game when you have very specialized builds going on that gives you some powerful options. Focus, of course, is great for just being able to boost physical damage for any physical-based class, as well as grinding XP and JP in downturns in any given battle. Stone is a fairly low damage but versatile option that you can utilize whenever it is that you just need to deal a little bit of extra damage to an enemy who's slightly far away. I love that as a possibility. Rush is nice for being able to get around very annoying and nasty counterattacks from bosses, monsters, enemies that have dangerous counter abilities, etc. It's limited in terms of its range and its damage capability, but just having that option available can actually be quite useful. And Salve is great for just being able to deal with common status effects, even if they're not the most obtrusive thing in Final Fantasy Tactics. The real issue comes in when we start talking about support abilities and movement abilities. The fact that Squire brings equip axes to the battlefield, despite axes being one of the worst weapon types in the game if you're not using them as a thrown option for ninjas, which is a whole different topic, is really a bit of a shame considering that you need 170 JP to equip the ability compared to the much more useful Beastmaster at 200 and JP boost at 250. Axes are not good enough to warrant this as an ability that you spend any JP on, let alone use your support ability slot on. So I would argue that one way that we can make Squires much stronger is by making them the axe experts alongside Geomancers. We'll get into this a bit more in a second, but I want Squires to have an innate ability that makes their axe skill much higher along with Geomancers, and that will free up a slot for them while still making equip axes actually viable. Next up, as far as Beastmaster is concerned, Beastmaster should really be spun into its own class. We have a Beastmaster equivalent in FFTA and TA2, and I think that should be the case in Tactics as well, as there's just a lot of missed opportunities with beasts in general. That should really be its own video topic that we will go into, but I would argue that Beastmaster should either be pulled out of the Squire skill set entirely, or if you don't want to have a Beastmaster class, I would argue that the Beastmaster skill should absolutely be modified to give its bonus to all monsters on the map to make it actually worth taking as a character support skill when there's so many better options. Defend, I think, is fine as it is just a very low level basic option for any sort of defensive type character that you replace early on. There should always be skills like that that are meant to just be taken early and then replaced later. And then finally, we have JP Boost. JP Boost should be removed from the game entirely, and the boost that it gives to characters should just be rolled into the way that JP acquisition functions for every single character in the game. The reason for this is that JP Boost essentially gives an increase to JP earned for any given action on a job based on the level of the job in question. As such, because it takes so long to get abilities for any given job, and because people choose, as a result, to run JP Boost on all of their characters for the majority of their game, I would argue that that is just how the game should function. And then as a result, if we remove that ability from the game, we can give Squire a new, unique ability that makes them more interesting to field as a result. This is a big change. We will talk more about it once we get out of this initial overview section. but I really think that JP Boost is the single worst aspect of Final Fantasy Tactics, despite loving it myself. Clearly seeing as how this is how the majority of people play, it should just be rolled into the way JP acquisition works, so we can move on and have more interesting tactical decisions. Finally, as far as movement abilities are concerned, Move Plus 1 does feel like a decent option. The idea of, I know how to properly pack my gear and carry my weight, and as such be more nimble and move farther as a basic trainee, it's not a bad option. It's not a bad option whatsoever. But again, you wind up being in a situation where Move Plus 1 just trumps many movement abilities for a very large section of the game. Movement is just so strong in Final Fantasy Tactics that even if you keep this as the skill of the Squire class, I feel like it should potentially either take more JP to use or to acquire, or it should have some sort of negative associated with it. If we're talking about JP required to learn it, I would say that it should be at least a 350 JP required ability. Of course, people are going to say, well, I'm just going to take longer to grind for it to get it, which is fair enough. In which case, that's where I would bring up my second recommendation for it, which is that it should have some sort of negative associated with it. And I feel like that should be the case for many abilities and many skills in Final Fantasy Tactics. In this case, I would argue a fairly basic, drop in HP would be a decent option to go with, seeing as how HP is such an important metric in Final Fantasy Tactics. Maybe if you equip Move Plus 1 on someone, they lose 5 or even 10% HP. And now you have to measure, okay, do I want to be super heavily armored? This is the concept, right? And maybe not be as optimized in the way I have my gear set up on my person, and as such I get extra move range, but I don't have quite as much HP. Or do I want to say, screw it, I want to be decked out from head to toe in plate mail. I don't get that movement bonus as a result, but I get way more HP. I think that's a compelling discussion to have, and would be a decent way to balance an ability that's otherwise such a universal and strong pick. Now, this is where I want to talk about the idea of axes as a fairly unique equipment option for squires. I mean, you can include flails as well, because I can equip them, but obviously equip axes is a particular skill of squires, and how that could kind of be rolled into their more, I would say, more unique job identity. So axes and flails and other quote-unquote random damage weapons are an interesting choice in Tactics, but they're generally never a good choice, because you want to really be able to rely on the damage output that any given character is going to have in whatever combat scenario you're in. Yeah, it can be really nice when you hit something with an axe and it deals 50% more damage than you were expecting it to, but the general reliability of just being able to know how much damage a character is going to deal with a sword or a spear or another type of melee weapon is just more valuable overall. So I would argue that the Squire should be your axe master. This is where we bring in innate skills. Think of something like Monk that has an innate brawler, right? I would argue that the Squire should have a sort of innate axe mastery or axe skill that shows that idea of sort of an inexperienced, wild martial ruffian, right? Someone who has some martial training, who's young, who's inexperienced, who has an up-and-coming potential for a physical master, who's going to take a big, blunt, unskilled weapon like an axe and just go to town with it, right? This is a skill that I would say should maybe reduce the overall damage range of an axe or a flail or a random weapon like that to a much more narrow range, say a 10%, maybe 20% margin. So if you're going to deal maybe 100 damage with an axe just as an easy base point to work from, you could deal 80 to 120 damage in anything in that range, as opposed to the way that random damage weapons in Tactics tend to work now, where you could hit for anything from 32 to 180, right? If we're using the same baseline of 100. Those are not exact numbers. I know there's going to be people in the comments who are like, actually, this is exactly how the formula works. I'm just going off the cuff right now, all right? Chill. I think that could be a good way to kind of have a more raw damage focused niche for squires in a similar way to how warriors work in Tactics Ogre Reborn, to give them a decent damage option and also give them a new support skill option over JP boost, where they could have that sort of axe mastery or focused strikes or something along those lines skill that you can take on other jobs that can use axes and flails, because I would roll flails into that same weapon class. That way, if you wanted to have a really good damage option for melee for your geomancers with their axes, you could do that. If you wanted to have like ninjas dual wielding flails, you could potentially take that to narrow the range on their damage output in melee. It could be a niche but fun option for a squire to take for future builds going forward, while still having the class have a decent damage option just built into the class, so you can still take maybe some other options on it as well. In that vein, I would still offer Equip Axe as an option if you wanted it, just as seeing as how there's not a ton of classes that can really take that ability, but I really think having something like a Focused Strikes ability that you can put on any class that can use flails or axes or anything that has a range of damage as opposed to a more focused damage could be a fun way of giving some versatility to the class. As far as reaction abilities are concerned, I would maybe consider the possibility of one additional reaction ability for Squire in terms of a sort of taking the bullet ability, right? Something like your lord is in danger and you jump in the way of the blow or the shot or something along those lines and take the damage for your master. Because think about it. If you are the squire of a noble knight of the Hokoten Knights, right? How likely is it that in that prestigious position, you would be willing to jump in the way of an enemy attack to take a blow for whoever it is that you have aligned yourself with? In terms of gameplay, I imagine this would just function for any character that's within like one space of the squire, but I think it could give a decent kind of naive reactive ability for these squire characters. Like, sure, if you get hit, you can just immediately charge at your opponent, try to deal some damage, knock them back, and take them by surprise. Or if you're standing next to your liege lord, being able to jump in the way and say, no, I'm taking this hit, whether you actually move your square with the allies square or whether you just jump in the way of the attack and then get back into your square. Either way, I think it could be a really interesting option to give your squires a little bit of defensive ability, seeing as how some classes like knight that squire immediately turns into do have a little bit more of a defensive bent. I'd like to see there being a little bit more overall representation of the different types of job roles that Squire can go into, represented in its base kit, so that a player naturally goes, oh, okay, these abilities are more for knight or more akin to archer or other jobs that I can go into. I think that could be a ton of fun. As far as equipment is concerned, I wouldn't really change anything for Squire. I think they have a very solid array of equipment that they can use, as well as unique options like axes and flails that, as we've discussed, we could probably lean into a little bit more as part of the job's speciality. I don't really think I have any changes I would make here. Maybe you could say that they could take a shield, but I kind of like the idea of a character that isn't even able to wield a shield jumping in the way of a blow for their master and just kind of dealing with it from there on. Maybe they parry it with their weapon, maybe they don't. That seems very thematic to me, so I wouldn't really make any changes there. Overall, I think these changes would give a lot of life to the idea of the Squire job, make it a little bit more of a reasonable option to hold on to longer than I got JP boost and move +1 on this character, and I now literally no longer care about this class, as is going to be the case for 99% of characters that you field in Final Fantasy Tactics. Of course, there's going to be other options available to you and ways you can modify things, update things. Some of you might say, well, I don't want there to be any changes at all to Squire because the idea is that it's a base class that you want to shift out of it. And I mean, I agree. But I think with the changes that I've proposed here, you still have so many different reasons to eventually drop Squire for other jobs, if for no other reason than that you can get two different active abilities, one of which isn't Fundaments, right? But I think it gives the job a little bit more versatility, a little bit more capability, It makes it a bit more interesting to hold on to longer than just grinding in Mandalia Plains to get those 2 abilities. That said, of course, I am not the sole expert in terms of Final Fantasy Tactics things here, so I would love to hear input from you. How would you change the Squire class to be a little bit more versatile, or would you change it at all? Let me know all of that in the comments below. Let me know what your thoughts are about my proposed changes, and overall, do you think we're going to wind up getting a remake or remaster for Final Fantasy Tactics? Because I certainly think so, but I'd love to hear what you feel as well. With all that said, I think I'm going to wrap this one up here. My name has been Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all have a good night. Stay safe and healthy out there. And remember, be good to each other. Bye now.